This video is going to be all about shocks. I'm going to give you a full breakdown of the setup I've been running for over 10,000 miles. Going to go into some of the things that you need to know before ordering shocks and talk about some of the features I feel like are worth having. All right, let's get to it. The first real shock upgrade my Gladiator received was when I installed the JKS manufacturing 3-inch suspension lift. When I ordered the kit, I optioned it with Fox 2.0 Performance Series shocks. These were lift-specific shocks, so I didn't have to do any additional measuring to make sure they would work. I had used these in the past on other Jeeps and been happy with the longevity and out-of-the-box performance. With my 37s and factory Rubicon axles, I felt the valving was perfectly fine for how I drive the Jeep both on-road and off. However, when I swapped out my stock axles over a year later with a much heavier and wider set of Dynatrac Pro Rock XT60s and 40-inch tall Nitto Trail Grapplers, I quickly found that the additional unsprung weight was too much for the compression valving of these shocks. Now, if you grew up riding dirt bikes like I did, the idea of adjusting compression and rebound isn't that foreign. On a vehicle, sort of the same thing, just on a slightly larger scale. Unfortunately, with a Fox 2.0 shock, there's really no easy way to just turn a knob and adjust the compression. However, there are shocks that have that ability, and that's what I ended up going with. I got a Fox 3.0 internal bypass race series shock. Now, I had a JK a few years ago that I had installed a set of Fox 2.5 series with the DSC adjusters on, and I loved it. Those shocks were pretty amazing, and it didn't take much to get it dialed in really well. And this Jeep is very similar to that in that it doesn't have a ton of up travel. It's fairly low. 3 inches of lift in 40s is definitely not a lot for a Gladiator. And so I was already facing those same kind of challenges. I wanted to be able to dial it in. That is the beauty of the compression adjuster. So that's what I ended up ordering. And up front, I'm using the company's, it's a 3 to 4.5 inch Gladiator specific shock, so no issues there. The one thing to note is you do have to have an aftermarket front drive shaft because it does give you a little bit more down travel. That wasn't a big deal for me because I already had a JE reel shaft with a 1350 CV on it, so that was all good. Out back, I'm using the 2 to 3 inch version of the shock, again Gladiator specific. The only big differences between the two shocks, the front shock actually has the remote reservoir, it's finned and it's separated. The rear one is actually attached to the body of the shock. Now, in terms of installing them, very simple, straightforward. Basically jack up the rear axle, pull your tires off. I used 2 jack stands just in front of the rear lower control arm mounts, and from there basically lowered the axle and did 1 shock at a time. That keeps it having too much pressure one way or the other. The shocks are about the same length, so not a big travel difference there. I did have to massage the lower mount on my Dynatrac axle to get the lower bolt in. It was a little tight, so that was the only, I guess, hiccup that I found there. Other than that, bolted right into place, and then just put the tire and wheel package back on, torqued the bolts down along with my lug nuts, and I was ready to move to the front axle. So up front, it's very similar as it was out back in that you're going to want to put your jack stands just behind the front lower control arm mounts. Then you can go ahead and pull off the tires and start taking off 1 shock at a time. In terms of the install, there is a different bracket for the lower shock mount that Fox provides. The upper mount is the same as the factory. On the frame side, to attach the reservoir, they do provide a bracket for this. I did notice that it was rubbing a little bit on the factory steel skid plate bracket, so I put a little relief in it, and that seemed to make that pretty easy. Beyond that, the only other sort of weird thing that I had to do is I'm still running the factory LED fog lights, and they are an asymmetrical plug setup, so I didn't have an issue on the passenger side, but the driver's side I actually had to flip the light upside down. I'll probably end up doing some sort of pod light eventually, but I found that there's not enough room for the reservoir and light to work correctly in its normal configuration, at least with my aftermarket rugged ridge front bumper. Now, I installed these shocks long before I did the bed upgrade, and when I did, I was running about 4.5 inches of up travel at that setup. Now, my Dobinson springs that I needed to kind of support this extra weight of the Mitts alloy bed, when it doesn't have anything in the bed, so no fridge and all that stuff, and it's fairly light, it sits at about 5.5 inches of up travel. Now, the total shock length for the rear in terms of travel is like 9.7 inches. So right now, I've got a little bit more up travel than I do down travel. Fox recommends that you have between 4.25 and 5.75 inches of up travel. And that is so you can actually utilize the internal bypass feature. If you're not familiar with how internal bypass work, it's pretty simple. It's basically, at least for the Fox shock, it has holes inside of this, basically the shock tube. And what it allows the fluid to do is bypass the piston during that sort of lower end of travel. And the benefit of this is it really makes all those little chatter bumps and going down gravel road and all that stuff, it kind of soaks that up so the suspension can kind of move quickly and doesn't have to pass through the valve stack on the piston. And once you move past this bypass zone, the fluid can't bypass anymore. It has to go through the piston, and you get into, I think, what they call a bump zone, which is just a more aggressive level of valving because it can no longer bypass. So I'm fine with how it's set up in the rear. Now, in the front, it's set up with about 3 inches of up travel currently. I'm probably going to end up swapping out my 3-inch coil springs to 4.5-inch coil springs, and that's going to get me to that Fox recommended 3.5 to 5 inches of up travel that you need so you can stay in that bypass zone before you get to the more aggressive valving. Right now, it's a little firmer in the front. I don't mind it. Again, I don't have a ton of up travel with this Jeep, so you really got to dial it in. The total shock travel for the front is 10.7 inches, so I've got a lot of down travel. This thing flexes tremendously off-road. It cycles really well. With it having 72.5-inch wide axles, it really has a wide stance, and it allows this thing to really get twisted up very well, so I don't have any complaints there. Now, you get 12 clicks of high-speed compression adjustment and 10 clicks of low-speed compression adjustment. And Fox tells you out of the gate, go ahead, turn everything to soft, then go back in 3 clicks. That's sort of their recommended starting floor. Now, one thing you will note is when you are turning the high-speed compression adjuster, you will see that the low-speed knob turns as well. Don't worry, it's just how the mechanism is. You're not actually turning the low speed at the same time. The high-speed knob has a very noticeable click, so you know when you are changing it. The low speed isn't as noticeable, and I will tell you, when you're going to adjust these, do it 2 at a time. That's really going to make the biggest difference. In my experience with these so far, I can tell you that when you're driving down the road and you're trying to sort of get rid of some of that head toss and that kind of, if you got a lot of weight in the back and you're getting ready to go on a big overland trip, that's going to be your low speed compression adjustment. Go ahead and turn those up by 2s, and you're really going to feel the vehicle settle, tighten up. If you're going to be driving this thing harder and you want it to almost feel like a sports car, low speed, go ahead and turn those up by a few clicks. That's going to be a big difference. The high speed is really more about off-road and on-road. It doesn't really matter. It's controlling whenever you're hitting something. So if you're going to hit, it doesn't matter if it's a speed bump or a rock in the trail. It's that event of it moving really quickly and cycling up that you're trying to slow down. So that's where you have to dial in your high speed. For me, I typically keep the high speed around 6 clicks. That works pretty well for my needs and how fast I want to go off-road. And I'm constantly adjusting them because I'm constantly changing how much stuff I have in this thing, or if I'm going out of town with the family and that sort of thing. And I love it. It doesn't take much. They're not really hard to get to. So I recommend, if you're going to get these, use them. Get out there. You don't need a special tool or anything. Just do it by your hand. And you'll really find that they make a big difference. Now on road, your shocks really don't move a whole lot. It depends really on the road, but I've got this massive 40-inch tall tire, so you don't see a ton of movement just driving down the highway. Now, speaking of highway miles, I have driven this Jeep a lot this year on a bunch of different adventures, and the biggest one being a 6,200 mile journey from North Carolina all the way out to the Rubicon Trail. Now, one thing that happened on the Rubicon is I actually broke my rear sway bar and the mount on the chassis. Now, it wasn't a really big deal, but I didn't have anything to fix it with me. So I ended up driving all the way back cross country without a rear sway bar. And what I did to sort of compensate for this is I dialed up the low speed compression adjuster, and that made a huge difference. It definitely kept the vehicle from kind of feeling like it was a little wallowy and tightened it up a good bit. I've since fixed the rear sway bar. I got a new link from JKS and everything's been fine. Now, in terms of general ride quality, you definitely can tell that these shocks control the axle a lot more. So going down the road, it definitely feels much tighter. And the more you go in with the compression adjuster, the tighter it feels. Now, off-road, you really need to dial in these shocks for whatever terrain you are on. You know, for rock crawling, you might want to pull out all of the compression and go completely to zero just to have that low, smooth feel. But that really depends on how much you're loaded up. With my Gladiator, I'm usually, you know, out of town when I'm climbing over stuff, so I've got a lot of gear with me, so I'm not pulling a ton of compression out. But a lot of it's going to depend on how you're driving, how much you've aired down your tires. You know, I'm typically down like 8 to 10 psi with my 40s. That takes a ton of imperfections out of the driving when you're off-road, so that really helps with the ride quality in general. Now, there are a few things that are also worth talking about. Number one, even though these are application-specific shocks, one of the things that I was a little worried about was the up travel for the front shock body. It's a bit longer than what I pulled off of here, and so what I did just to be on the safe side is I went ahead and pulled the front coils and I cycled the axle fully to make sure that the bump stop and the bump stop landing pads were hitting and collapsing fully before the shock shaft did, and thankfully it works perfect. I don't have an issue there. If you are concerned about that and your Gladiator has maybe a aftermarket axle configuration, an easy way to make sure that that's going to work before you order your shock is simply go to the manufacturer's website and they will show you the collapsed length of that shock from eyelet to eyelet. And what you'll do is take your coil out, cycle your front axle up, and measure from where it mounts at the top and it mounts at the bottom. And that measurement, that eyelet to eyelet, is going to let you know, okay, this shock is either too long or, oh yeah, it'll definitely work. Be very cautious here. You definitely don't want the body of the shock to become your bump stop, and you don't want to go with a shock that's too long, so you need to read the extended length as well, because you don't want the coil to actually come unsprung and fall out from the vehicle. The main goal here is to get usable travel, you know, so you're not leaving anything on the table. That's what I got to say about that. Thanks for hanging on to the end of the video. If you guys have any questions, just drop them in the comments. If you got anything for me, you can always find me at Ali Mansour Editor on Instagram. And until next time, hope to see you guys on the trail soon. Take care. Bye-bye.